It was still dark outside when the pounding on the front door rattled through the house. The homeowner, a man who had only recently begun to settle into the quiet neighborhood, stumbled out of bed and opened it to find two police officers standing stiffly in the glow of their flashlights. One of them asked a simple question, yet one that made the man's chest tighten. "Are you the homeowner here?" He nodded, confused and half asleep, but the chill in his stomach deepened when the officer explained that a member of the Homeowners Association had called the cops on him. Her name was Karen. What seemed like a bizarre misunderstanding that night quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Karen wasn't just a cranky neighbor. She was the president of the HOA board. And through the HOA, she held frightening power over every family in the community. For this man, who had stretched his finances to buy into what he thought would be a stable, long-term investment in his family's future, Karen's interference would become a direct threat not just to his comfort, but to the security of his property, the equity he was building, and the wealth he had tied up in his home. The home had been purchased carefully, after years of saving. Every mortgage payment was a sacrifice, but he told himself it was worth it, because unlike rent, those payments were building equity. Each dollar meant more ownership, more long-term value, and more financial safety. He had chosen Willow Creek precisely because it looked like the kind of neighborhood where property values climbed steadily, year after year. A place where a house was not just shelter, but a financial asset that could appreciate in value, one day making retirement easier or covering a child's college tuition. What he hadn't accounted for was how much control the HOA, and specifically Karen, could wield over that investment. The first warning sign arrived just a week after moving in, a violation letter for grass that was too long. The fine was $150. At first, he chuckled, figuring it must be a mix-up. But when he called the HOA office, Karen herself answered. Her tone was clipped and condescending. "The rules exist to protect property values," she said firmly. "If one homeowner lets their yard slip, the whole community suffers. You'll need to pay the fine immediately." Her words struck him. Protect property values. He understood the logic. He wanted the neighborhood to thrive just as much as anyone. But what she called protection, he was beginning to sense, was actually control. He later discovered that if such fines weren't paid, the HOA could place a lien against the property. A lien that would cloud the title and make refinancing a mortgage impossible. A lien that could eventually lead to foreclosure. The idea that one neighbor's complaint about grass height could spiral into losing the very roof over his family's head was chilling. So he paid. He told himself it was better to swallow one small fine than risk anything bigger. But Karen wasn't finished. In fact, she had just begun to test him. The next violation came in the winter, when holiday lights stayed up a little too long past the arbitrary deadline the HOA had set. Another letter. Another fine. This time, $500. His eyes had widened at the number. $500 could have gone toward an extra principal payment on the mortgage, shaving years of interest off the loan. Instead, it was being drained into the HOA's pocket, over a string of lights. What made it worse was the hypocrisy. Other houses on the block still glowed with festive bulbs well past the deadline. None of them were fined. When he asked why, he was told only that a complaint had been filed about his property. The pattern was obvious. Karen was targeting him specifically. Neighbors quietly warned him that Karen ran the HOA like a fiefdom. One recalled being fined $300 because the shade of beige on his mailbox wasn't compliant. Another had been forced to repaint a garage door twice in 1 year because Karen didn't like the tone. It was clear Karen was using the HOA's rules, not as community guidelines, but as weapons. The homeowner decided he needed to push back. At the next HOA meeting, he spoke up. He asked why he was being fined for issues others weren't. He asked where the fine money went, since the community pool was still under repair and the clubhouse roof still leaked despite years of rising fees. Karen stared at him across the table, her eyes cold. "If you can't afford the fines," she said icily, "maybe you can't afford to live here." The room fell silent, neighbors glancing at one another nervously. He clenched his fists but pressed on, demanding to see the HOA's financial records. If the money was truly being used to preserve the neighborhood and safeguard property values, There should be nothing to hide. Karen quickly changed the subject and railroaded the meeting onto another topic. But that night, when he returned home, he found an unmarked envelope stuffed into his mailbox. Inside was a photocopied invoice labeled HOA Special Fund. Thousands of dollars were listed as having been moved from HOA fines into a separate account. And at the bottom of the page was Karen's signature. The realization hit him like a punch. If this was real, Karen wasn't protecting property values at all. She was siphoning money out of the community for herself. Suddenly, all the unexplained delays made sense. Rising HOA fees, a pool that never reopened, repairs that were perpetually postponed. The money was disappearing because Karen was redirecting it. But he knew he needed more than one piece of paper. Without proof, Karen could retaliate. And retaliation was something he could not afford. He was already $1,000 deep in violations. According to the HOA bylaws, if the balance wasn't paid, the board had the authority to place a lien on his property. That wasn't just an annoyance. That was a direct financial attack. A lien meant his mortgage couldn't be refinanced, equity couldn't be tapped for emergencies, and even selling the house would become complicated because the lien would have to be satisfied first. The stress gnawed at him. Each month, he carefully budgeted to cover the mortgage, insurance, utilities, and the steadily increasing HOA dues. He knew that even one unexpected setback could tip everything over the edge. If he lost his job or a medical emergency struck, he wouldn't just be behind on payments. Karen's HOA could swoop in, pile on more fines, and put his home at risk. Still, he couldn't ignore what he had seen. The invoice hinted at embezzlement, and if that was true, Karen wasn't just harassing him. She was robbing the entire community. His investment, the equity he had worked so hard to build, was being drained not just by fines, but by corruption. Property values depended on trust, stability, and transparent management of the community's funds. If Karen's scheme came to light, values could plummet. His asset could depreciate overnight, and years of financial discipline would be undone. Determined, he began quietly documenting everything. Every violation notice, every fine, every unexplained fee increase. He took photos of neighbors' houses with the same supposed infractions that went unpunished. He spoke carefully with others, collecting stories. The more he gathered, the more he realized Karen had created a climate of fear. People paid fines without question, too afraid of retaliation. Most homeowners didn't even realize the HOA could foreclose on their homes over unpaid dues. They thought of fines as inconveniences, not potential disasters. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table flipping through his growing folder of documents, his wife asked the question he had been dreading. What if she really can take the house? He looked at the mortgage statement pinned to the fridge, the line showing the slow climb of equity they had built. They had put everything into this property. If it was stripped from them, they wouldn't just lose shelter. They would lose wealth, credit, and security. Starting over wouldn't be as simple as moving into a rental. It would mean years of financial recovery. The next morning, another violation letter arrived. This one accused him of improper landscaping, because a hedge on the side of his property had grown a few inches taller than the HOA guidelines allowed. The fine, $700. He stared at the paper, his pulse pounding. With every new fine, Karen was tightening the financial noose. $700 was nearly half his monthly mortgage payment. If he paid, it would strain their budget. If he didn't, the HOA could escalate. He knew then that he was being set up to fail. Karen wasn't trying to correct minor issues. She was trying to push him into default. If she could bury him in debt and force a foreclosure, the HOA bylaws allowed them to seize the house, auction it, and keep the proceeds after covering their costs. It was the perfect scam. Weaponize the rules, bankrupt the homeowner, then profit from the sale of the very asset they had stripped away. For the man, it was no longer about petty neighborhood disputes. It was about survival. His financial future, his investment, his very home were on the line. And the more he dug into Karen's activities, the more he realized she wasn't just a nuisance. She was a predator, and the entire community was her hunting ground. The days after the landscaping fine were heavy with unease. The man felt as though every movement in his own yard was being watched, every choice recorded and catalogued, waiting to be weaponized against him. It wasn't paranoia. He noticed Karen's blinds twitch when he pulled into his driveway. He caught her circling the block in her car during odd hours, slowing down whenever she passed his house. Even when he tried to relax in the backyard, he felt the invisible weight of her gaze pressing down. And the fines kept coming. A notice for an unsightly trash cans left visible for longer than permitted. Another for paint discoloration on a window trim. Individually, each might have been dismissed as a trivial annoyance. But together, they formed a pattern, one designed to overwhelm and exhaust. Each violation was a financial jab, and each jab threatened to weaken the foundation of his budget. The strain began to show in the household. His wife stopped suggesting family outings, worried about every dollar. His teenage son, once proud to invite friends over, muttered that he hated living in a place where even their mailbox could get them in trouble. Every meal at the kitchen table carried an undercurrent of fear. How many more fines would arrive this week? How much closer were they to being trapped by debt? But it was the mortgage statement that haunted him most. Every month, the balance decreased only slightly, principal chipping away slowly while interest consumed the rest. He had taken pride in knowing they were building equity, turning the house into an asset rather than a liability. Now that equity was under siege. Karen wasn't just creating expenses, she was undermining the stability of the very loan itself. He knew if liens were placed, lenders would see him as a risk. Refinancing would be out of reach. And in the event of foreclosure, everything they had already paid would be gone, swallowed by the system. His mind spun with what-ifs. What if his wife lost her job? What if the car broke down and drained their savings? In a healthy situation, they could draw from their home's value, maybe take a home equity line of credit. But if Karen succeeded in burying them in fines, those financial safety nets would vanish. She wasn't just threatening their comfort. She was closing off every avenue of resilience they had worked for. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, he sat at the dining room table with his laptop open, spreadsheets scattered around him. He tracked every expense, every fine, every irregularity in the HOA's fee increases. He noticed something peculiar. While most HOAs in nearby communities kept their reserve funds steady and transparent, Willow Creek's reserves fluctuated wildly. Some months, thousands of dollars disappeared, labeled only as administrative adjustment. Other months, special assessments were levied to rebuild reserves. It was like watching a magician shuffle money between hands, never letting anyone see where it truly went. The thought struck him hard. If the HOA's reserves were being siphoned, property values could collapse. Buyers did their research before purchasing. If an HOA reserve was underfunded, banks flagged it. Mortgages became harder to secure. Prices dipped. All it would take was one serious financial mismanagement report, and the homes in Willow Creek would lose value overnight. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Every neighbor's financial future was at risk. Determined, he reached out quietly to an old college friend who worked in real estate finance. Over coffee at a quiet diner outside the neighborhood, he explained the situation and showed the documents he had collected. His friend leaned back, frowning. "This isn't normal. At minimum, this looks like negligence. At worst, embezzlement." He tapped one of the statements. "If your HOA's reserves are this shaky, and word gets out, property values could tank. Buyers won't want to touch homes here. Lenders will back away. And honestly, with fines like these, she might be deliberately pushing owners into foreclosure. There's profit to be made if she controls who gets the houses afterward." The words chilled him. Profit. That was the key. Karen wasn't just power-hungry. She had a motive. If she could force foreclosures, she or her allies could buy the houses at auction for a fraction of their value. They could flip them or rent them, turning the community into a personal cash machine. And because everything was cloaked under the authority of the HOA, few people would even question it. That night, as he drove back through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Willow Creek, every porch light seemed sinister. How many families were on the brink because of Karen? How many had already lost their homes, their investments, their dreams of stability, without realizing they were victims of a larger scheme. He passed the empty house at the corner of Maple Drive, its windows dark, a foreclosure sign leaning against the porch. He had assumed its owners had simply fallen on hard times. Now he wasn't so sure. Back home, he told his wife what he had learned. Her face tightened with fear. "So she's not just targeting us," she whispered. "She's profiting from all of this." He nodded grimly. "And if we don't stop her, we could be next." From that night forward, their home became both a sanctuary and a war room. He and his wife worked late into the evenings, combing through public records, comparing HOA documents, piecing together the web Karen had spun. They discovered that Karen's name appeared not just on HOA accounts, but also in connection with a private LLC that had purchased 3 foreclosed homes in the neighborhood over the past 2 years. The pattern was undeniable. Fines, liens, foreclosure, acquisition. But the more evidence he gathered, the more danger he felt pressing in. A letter arrived one morning, not in the HOA's usual formal style, but typed in all caps and slipped under his door. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." His wife's hands trembled as she read it. His son asked why a strange car kept idling across the street at night. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating. Still, he refused to back down. He began attending HOA meetings religiously, bringing copies of documents, asking questions Karen dodged, pointing out discrepancies in the financial reports. Karen's eyes burned with barely contained rage each time he spoke. Once he leaned across the table and hissed, "You're playing with fire. You think you understand mortgages, equity, reserves, but you don't know how fast it can all be taken away." Her words weren't just a threat. They were a promise. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, he returned from work to find a sheriff's notice taped to his front door. His stomach dropped as he read it. The HOA had filed a lien against his property. His unpaid fines, now inflated with late fees and processing charges, had crossed the threshold that allowed the HOA to escalate. If he didn't pay within 30 days, they could initiate foreclosure proceedings. His home, his investment, everything could be stripped away. He sank onto the porch steps, the paper crumpled in his fist. The lien was like a dagger aimed directly at his mortgage. With it on record, refinancing was impossible. The safety net of a home equity loan was gone. Even if he tried to sell, buyers would be scared off by the legal tangle. Karen had him cornered. But as he sat there, anger simmered beneath the fear. He had proof. He had a story. And if Karen wanted to fight on financial ground, then that's where he would fight her. Not just as a homeowner, but as someone who understood now that his property was more than shelter. It was an investment, and he wasn't about to let her steal it. He decided to take the risk. He would go public. The decision to go public was not made lightly. He knew that once he spoke out, there would be no turning back. Karen had power, influence, and the veneer of legitimacy on her side. The HOA was an institution, and institutions carried weight in the eyes of neighbors, banks, and courts. But he also knew that silence would seal his fate. If he allowed her to choke him into submission, he would lose not only his house, but the principle that had driven every financial decision he had ever made. That hard work and investment should secure stability, not invite ruin. He began by reaching out to his neighbors quietly, choosing those he thought might already harbor doubts about Karen's leadership. At backyard fences and over coffee tables, he shared copies of financial statements and reserve fund reports. He showed them the LLC records linking Karen to foreclosed properties. He explained, in plain language, how an underfunded reserve tanked property values, how liens crippled equity, how foreclosure wasn't just punishment. It was profit for someone waiting in the shadows. Some neighbors reacted with disbelief. "She's strict, sure, but she wouldn't go that far," one said, shaking his head. Others grew pale, whispering about fines that had haunted them for months, about threats slipped into their mailboxes. Slowly, unease spread like cracks through glass. The image of Karen as a dutiful enforcer of neighborhood rules began to crumble. But Karen wasn't oblivious. At the next HOA meeting, she came armed with polished reports, glossy charts showing growth in the community's value, smiling as if the accusations were beneath her. She painted him as a troublemaker, someone trying to sow distrust for his own gain. "Every homeowner has responsibilities," she said sweetly, her eyes glinting. "Some people just can't handle the commitment that comes with ownership. They'd rather blame others than pay what they owe." It was a clever attack, framing him as irresponsible, a delinquent homeowner trying to dodge accountability. For a moment, he feared she might succeed. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, torn between the familiar order Karen represented and the disturbing evidence he had presented. That night, he returned home defeated, his dining table covered with unused handouts and printouts. His wife touched his shoulder gently. "Maybe you need to take this higher, beyond the neighborhood." Her words lit a spark. Higher. Beyond. If Karen wanted to weaponize the HOA's authority, then he would counter with institutions even larger. He began compiling a dossier, organizing every document, every pattern of suspicious activity, every irregularity in the reserves. He contacted the county housing authority, state consumer protection agencies, even a local journalist known for exposing real estate scams. At first, responses were tepid. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and HOAs often hid behind legal protections. But when he finally secured a meeting with the journalist, everything changed. She was sharp, direct, and immediately understood the stakes. "You're telling me this woman is leveraging HOA fines to trigger foreclosures, then buying the houses herself?" she asked, her pen scribbling furiously. "That's not just predatory, that's systemic theft disguised as governance." The journalist promised to investigate. She requested access to records, interviews with neighbors, and copies of the liens. For the first time in months, he felt the crushing weight on his chest begin to ease. If this story reached the public, Karen's carefully built facade could collapse. But Karen struck back quickly. Within a week, he received notice of another fine, this time for unauthorized alterations to his driveway. An accusation so absurd it was almost laughable. Almost. But the fine wasn't small. With penalties stacked, it ballooned into several $1,000s. The lien against his property swelled. The threat of foreclosure crept closer. His wife's voice trembled as she read the notice. "We can't keep doing this. What if they actually take the house?" He clenched his fists. That's exactly what she wants. She wants us scared enough to pay, or to give up. He paused and added, "But if we give in now, we'll lose everything anyway. Our equity, our investment, our future. We fight." The fight took a heavier toll than he imagined. Lawyers' fees piled up as he sought counsel to protect his home. He dipped into savings, canceled vacations, cut every unnecessary expense. He sold stocks he had hoped to keep for retirement just to cover legal retainers. Each choice was a sacrifice, and each sacrifice tied him deeper into the struggle. His family bore the weight too. His son snapped at dinner, asking why they couldn't just move somewhere else. His daughter began avoiding friends, embarrassed by the gossip circulating at school about their family's trouble with the HOA. The house, once a symbol of progress, now felt like a fortress under siege. Yet even in the darkest moments, he reminded himself why he fought. This wasn't just about a building. This was about the decades of work poured into mortgage payments, about protecting the equity that was supposed to fund his children's college, about preserving the investment that stood between his family and financial instability. Karen wasn't just threatening his roof and walls, she was threatening their entire future. Then came the turning point. One late evening, as he sorted through yet another stack of HOA correspondence, his wife noticed a line in the fine print that seemed out of place. It was a reference to special assessment funds reallocated under emergency discretion. She frowned. Didn't she say at the last meeting that the reserves were stable? Why would she need emergency reallocation? Digging deeper, they traced the reallocation to a contractor payment. But when they looked up the contractor, it didn't exist. Not legally, at least. It was a shell, registered to an address that turned out to be a P.O. box, and the person listed as the contact, a cousin of Karen's. It was the smoking gun. Fraud, hidden in plain sight. Money from homeowners was being funneled into fake companies, drained from the community, while Karen levied fines to cover the manufactured shortfalls. He immediately called the journalist, who nearly shouted with excitement through the phone. "This is it. This is the piece that makes the whole thing undeniable." She promised to fast-track the investigation. Within days, she had interviews scheduled with other homeowners, some of whom began confessing their own stories of harassment and financial strain. Word spread quickly, and tension in Willow Creek reached a boiling point. Neighbors who had once been silent began whispering in the streets, trading stories of mysterious fines and sudden liens. A quiet rebellion brewed, fueled by the knowledge that their financial security, their mortgages, their equity, their investments, was being systematically attacked. Karen responded with fury. She convened an emergency HOA meeting, her voice sharp and venomous as she denounced false rumors and malicious lies. She singled him out directly, accusing him of conspiring to undermine the community, of fabricating evidence to avoid paying his dues. Her words dripped with venom, but her eyes betrayed something else: fear. Because now, for the first time, the balance of power shifted. He was no longer the isolated homeowner battling fines in silence. He was the voice of a movement, backed by neighbors, armed with evidence, and supported by the press. But the battle was far from over. The liens still loomed. The fines still accumulated. The threat of foreclosure was real and imminent. The journalist could expose the fraud, but legal processes would take time, and time was the one resource he had in shortest supply. As he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized the grim reality. To protect his home, he might need to gamble. He would have to leverage the very thing Karen was trying to steal: his equity. If he refinanced quickly, before the lien solidified further, he could secure cash to cover the legal war ahead. It was a dangerous move, one that could backfire if the bank caught wind of the disputes. But without it, he risked losing everything. He turned to his wife and whispered the plan. She looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "You're talking about putting the house itself on the line." He nodded. "It's already on the line. This way, at least, we're the ones making the choice." And with that, the next phase of the battle began, not just against Karen, but against the clock. The refinancing process was a gauntlet of paperwork and patience. He sat across from the loan officer, hands clasped tightly. Knowing every word he spoke could determine whether his family had a chance to fight or was left defenseless. The officer's eyes flicked over the file, pausing at the lien. "This complicates things," she said slowly. "But your payment history is solid, and your equity is substantial. If we move quickly, we can push this through before the lien progresses to foreclosure status." Every signature felt like rolling dice. He was leveraging the very home Karen threatened to take, betting on the hope that exposing her fraud would happen before the new loan became another burden. But it worked. Within weeks, the refinance was complete. The influx of cash was both relief and poison. Relief because it gave him the means to fund legal battles. Poison because the debt was heavier, the stakes sharper. He had doubled down, turning his home into both shield and sword. Karen, of course, sensed the shift. Notices from the HOA grew more aggressive, arriving almost daily. Threats of court action, demands for escalating fines, accusations of non-compliance with increasingly absurd rules. One letter even claimed his lawn ornaments were a violation of community aesthetic standards. He laughed bitterly. What's next, fining us for the color of our curtains? But the laughter didn't mask the exhaustion in his voice. Meanwhile, the journalist's investigation exploded. The first article dropped with the force of a thunderclap. HOA president accused of profiting from foreclosures. The piece laid bare the fraudulent contractors, the shell companies, the pattern of foreclosed homes tied to Karen's inner circle. It quoted neighbors anonymously, detailing harassment and suspicious fines. His own story was front and center, painted not as a delinquent homeowner but as a whistleblower risking everything. The community was stunned. Some homeowners were furious, storming into the HOA office demanding explanations. Others were frightened, unsure whether speaking out would make them targets. But the tide had turned. Karen was no longer the unquestioned authority. She was under scrutiny, her reputation cracking under the glare of public attention. Karen retaliated with icy precision. She hired a high-powered attorney, sending cease and desist letters to the journalist, threatening lawsuits for defamation. She doubled down on public appearances, smiling at community events, insisting that the accusations were fabrications orchestrated by a bitter homeowner who couldn't pay his bills. But the more she smiled, the more it looked like a mask. He refused to back down. With refinancing funds at his disposal, he hired forensic accountants to dig deeper. What they uncovered was damning. Karen had not only funneled money through fake contractors, but had also manipulated reserve studies, overstating costs to justify special assessments. She had created artificial emergencies, draining funds to her benefit while homeowners paid inflated dues. The accountant's report was a bombshell. It quantified the theft, hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned from the community over several years. It detailed how underfunded reserves depressed property values by 10–15%, robbing every homeowner of equity. The numbers were undeniable, the patterns clear. He presented the report at the next HOA meeting. Karen tried to dismiss it, waving it away as misinterpretation. But when homeowners saw graphs showing the decline in reserve funding alongside the rise in her affiliated company's revenue, the room erupted. Shouts filled the hall. One neighbor stood and demanded her resignation on the spot. Others called for a full audit. For the first time, Karen's composure faltered. That night, Karen's car was seen speeding out of the neighborhood, her headlights cutting through the dark. Some whispered she was panicking, preparing to cover her tracks. Others feared she was plotting her next move. For him, it didn't matter. He knew she wasn't finished. People like Karen didn't crumble quietly. And indeed, the storm worsened. Weeks later, he received a notice from the county courthouse. The HOA had officially filed for foreclosure proceedings against his property. His heart sank as he read the words, the paper trembling in his hands. Despite the journalist, despite the accountants, despite the community's rising anger, Karen had pulled the trigger. His wife broke down in tears. After everything, after all we've done, they can still take it. He wrapped his arms around her, his own voice cracking. Not if we fight harder. Not if we stay louder than her lies. The legal battle became all-consuming. His attorney argued that the fines were fraudulent, that the foreclosure was retaliatory, that Karen had abused her authority. Karen's side argued that rules were rules, dues were dues, and non-payment was non-payment. To the court, it was paperwork and statutes. To him, it was life and death. During the proceedings, the journalist published a follow-up exposé, this time national in scope. When HOAs become predators. The dark side of community associations. It wasn't just about Willow Creek anymore. The article highlighted cases across the country where HOA leaders had abused power, levied crushing fines, and forced families out of their homes. Karen's face appeared beside the headline, her smile a stark contrast to the accusations beneath. The public outrage was palpable. Talk shows debated the role of HOAs. Politicians called for oversight. Homeowners from other states wrote in, sharing their own horror stories. What had begun as one man's fight was becoming a movement. But movements didn't pay court costs. Every day was a balancing act, managing legal bills, mortgage payments, and the gnawing fear of eviction. His children tiptoed around the subject, their once vibrant home now cloaked in tension. Even holidays felt hollow, celebrations overshadowed by the looming question, would they still be here next year? Then came a breakthrough. The forensic accountants, digging deeper, uncovered an offshore account tied directly to Karen. Money siphoned from the HOA had been funneled overseas, hidden in layers of shell corporations. It was financial fraud on a scale far beyond what anyone imagined. His attorney's eyes lit up when he saw the documents. This isn't just civil. This is criminal. They forwarded the evidence to federal authorities. Within weeks, investigators descended on Willow Creek. Subpoenas were issued. Karen's bank accounts were frozen. Her lawyer quit, citing irreconcilable conflicts. The facade of control she had so carefully constructed was collapsing under the weight of her own greed. The foreclosure proceedings stalled as authorities investigated. His attorney filed motions to dismiss, citing fraud and abuse of process. For the first time, the threat receded, replaced by cautious hope. Yet, victory felt distant. The damage was already done. His refinanced debt loomed. His savings were gutted. His family's peace of mind shattered. Even if Karen was removed, even if the HOA was restructured, could they ever truly feel secure again? The community rallied around him. Neighbors brought meals, offered help with legal research, and even started a petition demanding Karen's removal. A special election was called, and for the first time in years, homeowners felt the stirrings of democracy instead of dictatorship. On the night of the vote, the community center buzzed with energy. People lined up, ballots in hand, whispering about freedom, about fairness, about taking back control. Karen sat stiffly at the front, her smile brittle, her eyes darting nervously. When the count was finished, the result was clear. She was out. The room erupted in cheers. Neighbors hugged. Some cried. For him, the relief was overwhelming. But it wasn't the end. The lawsuits, the debt, the scars, they all remained. Yet as he looked around at the sea of faces united at last, he realized something profound. This fight had never been just about his house. It was about everyone's. It was about the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, had the right to weaponize financial systems against ordinary people. As Karen was escorted out, her head held high but her empire crumbling, he allowed himself a small, weary smile. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time he believed victory was possible. And yet, deep down, he knew. People like Karen didn't vanish. They regrouped. They resurfaced. The question wasn't whether the fight was finished. The question was whether he and his neighbors were ready for the next chapter. Because in the world of HOAs, power and money were never truly gone. They just changed hands. The days after Karen's removal were strange, almost surreal. For years her shadow had loomed over every interaction, every letter in the mailbox, every board meeting. Without her, the neighborhood felt lighter, though not entirely free. The new board, comprised of volunteers who had once been her harshest critics, promised transparency and reform. They spoke of audits, of restoring reserves, of rebuilding trust. But for him, the wounds were still raw. He walked the streets of Willow Creek, noting the small signs of relief among his neighbors. Lawns once neglected began to bloom again. Fences were repainted. Children played freely in driveways without fear of fines for stray toys. It was as if the community itself had taken its first deep breath in years. But beneath the relief was an undercurrent of unease. The lawsuits were still active, the foreclosure technically pending until dismissed by the court. His refinance payments loomed each month, a stark reminder that the battle had drained his financial future. The equity he once saw as a safety net was now a fragile shield, threatened by interest rates and legal bills. At night he pored over spreadsheets, balancing expenses, projecting cash flow, recalculating what it would take to recover. His attorney assured him that with the fraud evidence in federal hands, the foreclosure would be thrown out. Still, he couldn't sleep. He knew banks didn't care about fairness. They cared about numbers. He understood too well how quickly a family could slide from stability into foreclosure, not because of irresponsibility, but because of predators hiding behind rules. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table with his wife, she asked quietly, "Do you think it's worth it? All this debt, all this stress, just to keep a house?" He looked at her, eyes tired but resolute. "It's not just a house. It's everything we've worked for. It's our kids' stability. It's our investment. And if they can take it from us unjustly, they can take it from anyone. That's why it matters." His words weren't just for her. They were a mantra for himself. Because the truth was, he had moments of doubt. When bills piled up, when phone calls from creditors came late at night, when his children whispered about friends whose parents had lost their homes, he wondered if the fight was slowly consuming the very thing he was trying to protect. But then a letter arrived. Not from Karen, not from lawyers, but from a stranger in another state. The envelope was handwritten, the words inside shaky but powerful. I read your story. Our HOA did the same thing. We lost our house. I wish I had fought back like you did. Thank you for showing people it's possible. He held the letter for a long time, tears welling in his eyes. It wasn't just his battle anymore. His struggle had become a symbol, a warning, and a rallying cry. People across the country were watching, learning, and resisting because of what he had endured. The journalist continued to cover the unfolding saga. With Karen's ouster and federal investigators circling, the story had shifted from one community to a national conversation about unchecked HOA power. Experts weighed in, citing how associations controlled trillions of dollars in real estate value, how a single foreclosure could erase generations of family wealth, how the lack of oversight created opportunities for abuse. His name became synonymous with resistance. Invitations came from advocacy groups, asking him to speak about his experience. Legislators reached out, seeking testimony as they drafted bills to regulate HOA practices. Each time he spoke, his voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as he recounted the threats, the liens, the fraudulent fines, the sleepless nights. He wasn't just telling his story, he was giving voice to thousands of others. Meanwhile, Karen's world unraveled. Federal charges were filed: wire fraud, embezzlement, racketeering. The offshore accounts were traced, the shell companies exposed. She was led away in handcuffs, her once proud demeanor replaced by defiance that fooled no one. News crews captured the moment, broadcasting it across the country. For many, she became the face of HOA corruption, a cautionary tale of power twisted by greed. Yet victory was bittersweet. His refinance debt was still real. The foreclosure threat, though stalled, had left scars on his credit. The legal fees had eaten into savings that would take years to rebuild. The house itself, once a sanctuary, now carried the weight of battles fought within its walls. But as he stood on the porch, watching his children play freely at last, he knew the cost had been worth it. The new board moved swiftly to restore order. A full audit was conducted, confirming the forensic accountant's findings. They restructured dues, reinstated fair rules, and began rebuilding reserves responsibly. Property values began to climb again, no longer dragged down by Karen's manipulations. Equity returned, slowly but steadily, like a wound healing. Neighbors who had once lived in fear now gathered freely, sharing stories, laughing, rediscovering the sense of community that had been stolen from them. Block parties returned. Decorations flourished during the holidays, and the neighborhood that had once been a battlefield began to feel like home again. Still, he knew the fight wasn't just local. He had seen too much, learned too much. He understood how fragile financial stability was, how quickly equity could vanish, how easily predatory systems could strip families of everything. And so, even as life settled into a fragile peace, he continued to speak, to write, to advocate. His story ended not with quiet but with purpose. Because the truth was, Karen had almost taken his home. But in trying, she had given him something greater, a mission. He would not rest until the laws changed, until oversight was real, until no family had to face the nightmare his had endured. And as the sun set over Willow Creek, casting golden light across neatly kept lawns and houses standing proud, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The house was still his, and so was the fight. Because some battles aren't just about bricks and mortar. They're about equity, justice, and the right to protect what you've built. And when one man stands up against corruption, it sends a message that echoes far beyond one neighborhood. Karen had called the cops when he returned early. She had tried to break him with fines, with liens, with threats. She had nearly cost him his home. But in the end, she had lost everything, and he had gained something no one could take away. The proof that even against the most ruthless odds, the fight was worth it. And somewhere, deep in the silence of her downfall, Karen must have realized the truth. Power built on stolen wealth crumbles, but a home defended with everything a man has endures.